Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have America's annual celebration of lost fingers, the plan to try and deploy a much better vaccine schedule to try and protect Americans in this case against the flu, COVID and RSV, the failure to some extent of public health to ensure that raw milk does not get legalized. The observation that a synthetic cell is evolving much faster than naturally occurring cells would normally do so. The fact that the smell of your hands can better indicate your sex than many other variables. Sea lampreys are playing up in America's Great Lakes, and scientists have found that cells sacrifice themselves around a developing embryo to protect it. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with July 4th and America's favourite celebration of lost fingers, and for that matter, other accidents. The simple reality is that the average number of admissions to emergency rooms on July 4th between 2000 and 2018 is nearly 2,500. By contrast, you have New Year's and Christmas, the average is around 100 to 300, or thereabouts. As you can imagine, when you get to a point where you're somewhere in the 6 to 7-fold range of increased injury around other major celebrations, it indicates that Americans really aren't good at using fireworks. And the simple fact is, for the most part, that's because they screw up, set their fuse too short, or there's misfires, and then proceed to have the firework explode when they're nearby, costing them their hand and fingers. Which sucks. 2,500 injuries may not sound like much, and overall it's not in the big picture. If you were to look at the injuries throughout a year, they sit somewhere around 200. However, in the first 8 days of July, they sit at 16th. That is how much the rate of injury increases. And it's not just a single year. This is consistent year on year. And you can see various graphs that have been produced over the years as to what, where, and how. Interestingly, it's not just hands and fingers that are particularly liable to be wounded. Also lower limbs. And this is largely because idiots are either getting too close to fireworks when they're setting them off, or they didn't go off properly, and then as they're approaching the fireworks, they explode, and, well, you're close enough to be injured in your lower extremities. This has led to, let's say, campaigns to try and minimize the number of injuries sustained, rather unsuccessfully given the very long history of these injuries occurring despite best efforts. That's why, although we're optimistic, we are also extremely skeptical of the success for a plan to use a three-pronged defense against influenza, COVID, and RSV. Influenza or flu and COVID are, well, fairly well known to most people. RSV, or rhinosinusitis virus, is not so well known unless you are either a parent of a very young individual or older, where it is a concern. And that's where the plan lies at the moment, to try and vaccinate the elderly in particular for RSV, but along with the other two diseases, but everybody gets flu and COVID. This provides a relatively effective blanket protection. Further to that, it's also evidence that governments are recognizing the need to update the COVID vaccines, and so they have specifically requested that vaccine manufacturers reformulate the vaccine to accommodate the changing variants. There is something to be said about the idea of bringing bureaucrats in to administer, well, what is in this case public health measures, and just how efficient that is. But ignoring bureaucracy, the fundamental and underlying idea is at least theoretically sound. But there is the somewhat awkward quote, that is, in this lab, we have both practice and theory. In theory, everything works. In practice, nothing does. And this is why the theoretical effectiveness of this plan to deal with what has been called the tripledemic is optimistic, but not necessarily going to pan out. In other update news, the World Health Organization has altered their malnutrition treatment guidelines. The simple reality is that malnutrition is difficult to treat, and we've known this since fundamentally as far back as World War I, World War II, where there was a systemic attempt to figure out how to deal with it. If you give an individual too much food, too rich food, or various other issues too soon after they've begun to starve, you actually have a lot of resistance from the body, and as a result, you can kill the individual. Malnutrition is similar in respect to its difficulties. Primarily, how do you deal with those individuals who lack necessary essential vitamins, nutrients, minerals, amino acids, etc.? That is why they've changed the guidelines. We better know what to do with differing severities of malnutrition, and with what technology we have available now, and that knowledge base, we can better accommodate malnutrition. In similar news about supporting individuals, we have the idea that vitamin D supplements will prevent heart disease. Now, to be very clear about this, a balanced diet with all of the essentials in your life, vitamins, minerals, etc., will keep you in good health, as long as they're taken in moderation and within the roughly recommended daily intake, or at least averaged out over a reasonable period of time. Any extremes of any vitamin, mineral, nutrient, etc. are likely to cause more trouble than they're worth, and in many respects are simply money thrown away for nothing. Vitamin D, however, gets a lot of attention, given that, to be quite blunt about this, many people spend a great deal of their time working indoors, and as a result, they don't actually get their vitamin D activated, which leads to issues. Primarily lack of vitamin D. Ignoring the reality that many individuals lack vitamin D for that reason, there has been a promotion of it as a panacea, but particularly with regards to things like heart disease, and to be quite blunt about it, no, not really. We say this not necessarily because there's simply no evidence for support of vitamins and supplements in general, but rather due to a very large and very long-term study, at least by relative standards. It involved approximately 21,000 individuals split into roughly 2 equal groups. One given vitamin D, and a reasonably high dose at that for what it is, and the other half given a placebo. Neither researchers nor individuals involved in the study had any idea, so it's pretty much your gold standard of clinical trials for the purposes of this. They found that if they took it appropriately and they didn't supplement their intake through other supplements, they had no difference between their groups, and so this was pretty useful. This means that no, it wasn't useful for heart health. However, there is a significant carve-out, as there is with, well, most supplements for that matter, that are nutritional. That is, if your diet is already deficient in these things, then rather obviously, taking a supplement is going to be of benefit. To what extent and over what time frame that benefit exists is still somewhat up for question. But so long as your diet, as mentioned at the very beginning of this section, is already adequate, you gain nothing from doing so. In other dietary news, we have the shift in marketing from selling pasteurized and generally homogenized milk to the increased popularity of raw milk. At its simplest, raw milk is simply milk taken from the cow, processed enough to get it into individual bottles. From there, is shipped to retail outlets and stored in a fridge until purchased, and then stored in the consumer's fridge until they themselves drink it. There is no further processing involved. And that's the issue here. The reason raw milk lost its popularity is that it can be dangerous. Now, to be clear about this, we are not saying all raw milk in all cases. We are saying that there is a considerably greater risk of those who have raw milk to have issues from it. And that's because the process of extracting raw milk and then transporting, bottling, and everything else can introduce pathogens. This is why pasteurization became, well, not only popular, but in many areas a legal requirement. it removed the issue of any kind of contamination that occurred up to and until bottling of the milk, and that's because pasteurization kills just about all the pathogens that may have gotten into the bottle. Although the idea occurred in the 1800s with Louis Pasteur, the actual practice was pretty much universal by 1950, and that reduced the spread of all kinds of pathogens, which is incredibly good for most people. However, there is this bizarre throwback to the better, older, golden days that, well, had tuberculosis and other diseases widespread, along with a desire for a natural milk that has idiots trying to purchase it and making it popular once more. It is unfortunately a kind of regression where things that we have successfully introduced that were effective and did what they were supposed to do are no longer desired because we've become complacent, and there is the expression, complacency breeds contempt. In this case, people are so used to milk being safe that they figure if it's natural, it must still be safe. No. We might as well try bloodletting at that point as well. All sorts of things that aren't going to demonstrate effectiveness, simply because they used to be used and they're natural. Mercury is natural, and it sure as hell isn't good for you. Other than the obvious and immediate concerns about consuming raw milk with bacteria within it, there is a more serious concern. That is, if raw milk gets into individuals, and to be quite blunt about this, it does drastically increase the chances of infection. Pathogen or pathogens that infect an individual or many individuals can pass through them and become more pathogenic, and this then re-enters the system through sewage, or in a very unfortunate situation, through something like a septic system. This leads to a strengthening or reinforcing of bacteria by virtue of the fact that you've basically had them pass through the human body, and by surviving, they've become stronger. You can imagine that if one person in a household gets something like gastroenteritis or some other foodborne pathogen or disease, you're going to get all of the family members eventually infected if it's strong enough, and raw milk increases the risk of that to happen. In further news about animals, we have the darker side of things like coconut milk and, well, vegans. Specifically, that much of the coconut products that are purchased in terms of things like vegan milk and coconut milk are sourced by enslaving monkeys and using them to, well, harvest the coconuts. This is further evidence that vegans should be called out and despised for not just being vegans, but rather their entire dietary concept is, well, unsustainable. In this case, we have, admittedly, evidence from PETA, so take it with a lot of consideration and, well, not even salt, just dunk it in the ocean. The issue here is that they're claiming that the farmers are forcing the monkeys to go up onto the trees, harvest the coconuts for hours on end, and then basically get sent back to where they live and are chained to the floor. Much like other animals in various capacities that are used for agricultural or food production, this is a controversy that could prove difficult to balance both the treatment of animals versus the outcomes and the claimed benefits. Next we have more fundamental news in terms of evolution and development of synthetic cells. Synthetic cells are not necessarily new, but they haven't been around for very long either. Most of them are made with the idea of being as simple as possible to be able to fundamentally prevent any kind of complications and unnecessary or extraneous variables from happening. This lets researchers create a model, or in this instance, study the evolution of a particular organism. One of the earliest was the Synthetic Yeast Genome Project, but there have been others. In this case, researchers in the US and Brazil watched what happens when you take all but the absolutely bare essential genes out of a cell and see what happens in evolutionary terms. They used Mycoplasma myosides, which is a parasitic bacterium, and although not necessarily a particularly exciting species for most humans, the 900 genes that were left within it are incredibly helpful to see what happens. You can study how these 901 genes, which were the bare minimum required, could theoretically lead to the thousands and thousands of genes that are otherwise used within the bacteria itself, arguably even tens of thousands in the end. It's important to understand that any and just about all mutations that occur within an organism are adverse to its survival. That is, unlike what Marvel or DC Comics would have you believe, mutation is not good. In fact, most of the time it either does nothing or it will kill the host. As a result, the fact that they boiled down the genome of this bacterium to only what it absolutely and completely needs means that any mutation in those genes would probably kill it. Weirdly enough, by following the bacterium for about 300 days, or roughly 2,000 generations, there was a very high rate of mutation despite this. And that's important. Remember, there are only 900 genes within its genome, and most of these would have experienced some kind of mutation for some reason amongst them. Weirdly, it's about 40% faster than the wild type or naturally occurring version of the bacteria. Next we have a interesting question, let's say. It's all raised by a tweet by Carolyn Wendling. The short version is that their name has been attributed to a paper that they've had no real involvement with, other than being asked a few questions about it at the very beginning of its conception, let's say. And as a result, they've been attributed as an author which could be considered misconduct of various kinds. That's an issue, and particularly given that the journal, or group of journals, let's say, that publishes is Frontiers. Frontiers has a polarizing reputation. Some people will describe it as a accessible, widely respectable, but somewhat flawed journal, and others as a predatory journal that will happily publish anything as long as you pay their still rather high fees. And unfortunately, there hasn't really been much of a response yet. The challenge with this is not just that they appear to have published this article without one of the authors being aware. Rather, the issue is that in order to get it retracted, it's not likely that an individual author could get this done. They also probably can't get themselves removed as is. Rather, they would have to go through their university and hope that they could get the journal itself to agree to either remove the author from the list, which is already an issue, or to get it retracted in its entirety, which is an even bigger problem, particularly if any of these are junior researchers. Next we have somewhat bizarre news in terms of the ability to identify someone's sex by sniffing their hand, and perhaps this is what gave rise to the idea of kissing someone's hand in much earlier cultures. The research is odd in that it found that the sex of an individual does carry a particularly distinctive scent, and that by analysing the proteins involved, you can figure out which is male and which is female, although this is a rather small study with just 30 males and 30 females. The accuracy is, however, at least somewhat higher than you would expect. It's about 96%. However, 96% isn't exactly great given the small size. Given that the idea is to use this for forensics, it's not surprising to find that the sampling is small at this point. The proposal is that you could use analysis of hand odor to differentiate someone's sex in forensic investigations. In other weird research news, although not necessarily overt research, we have what the Russian Navy is doing with military dolphins. There have been multiple reports and releases from the UK government and the Ukrainian government that Russia has been using trained dolphins, amongst others, to do various things, but the biggest one has been to deter divers. To be quite blunt about this, dolphins can be arseholes. They are very aggressive, and they can be quite nasty if you get on their bad side. This means that they will attack someone if they think they are a threat of some kind. Given the nature of what's happened to Russian forces in Ukrainian area, and particularly around Crimea, it's no surprise that they would want to deter divers with nefarious plans. It will be interesting to know the full extent of what Russia's been experimenting with in terms of their marine animal military endeavours. In other marine animals, and somewhat terrifying ones for that matter, the sea lampreys within the Great Lakes of America are behaving a little bit odd. Lampreys have a fairly straightforward life, and that's why they're called parasitic. They attach themselves to a host and begin sucking out blood. This provides them with all their nutrition. They are effectively a water-based version of a leech, just much hardier and much larger. The reason they are noteworthy is twofold. The first is simply that they have a significant effect on the number of fish that can be caught within the Great Lakes. This means the more lampreys there are, the fewer fish can be caught, and this means that it's less effective to fish there. That's going to have an effect on the American economy because, well, fishing makes up at least some of it. The second is that it also affects the native habitat and wildlife. The more lamprey there are, the more loss there is in these species. That's why it's noteworthy at the moment. There has been a considerable increase in the number of lampreys over the last few years, as wildlife management wasn't able to go out and perform the control actions they would normally do. Without being able to control the population, it has grown. Although they did manage to knock it down by 90%, so by how much it's grown is something of a question. In technology news, we have Google's quantum computer, which is said to be faster than the world's current supercomputer, and by up to 47 years. Now, understand, this is how much of a leap it's considered to be, not necessarily how much it actually is. You could arguably say that if Moore's law was still current, every year you have a doubling of power in computers. So, by the time you account for a doubling of computers every 47 years, it is something of a massive margin. The way they get to the conclusion that it's 47 years ahead of it isn't necessarily related to that benchmark of power. It's more related to the amount of time for the current leading frontier supercomputer to achieve the same results. It would have taken 47 years to do what Google's quantum computer did in a matter of moments. There are several issues with it, however, and these include the fact that it's effectively an entirely synthetic benchmark. It has no real relationship to real-world applications. As a result, although they can make this claim, it's not necessarily true that it would be applicable. The second is that the results have been published in a pre-publication server. That means no peer review of, well, for example, the methodology, which could well be flawed. But more importantly, there's been no real input as to what they've claimed and whether or not the results, the background, and the end results that they've described are really accurate or consistent with what you'd expect or want to see. Next, we have the discovery that during embryonic development, certain cells self-destruct, and in doing so, they protect the developing human embryo from other issues. Part of this is simply down to controlling the cells that are produced during the extreme expansion of cell population during embryonic development. Remember that you go from being what is effectively a single cell to millions and millions, if not trillions, of cells. Millions during the earlier stages of fetal development, arguably not just trillions, but many times trillions, once you even start to get to the point where you're going to be born. And then you have an actual human that's been birthed. Mutations, changes, and other issues within the cells at these earlier stages are arguably among the biggest threats to successfully carrying an embryo to birth. The problem is, we know almost nothing about this, largely because it's practically impossible to be able to study it. This is where research into 5-day-old embryos found that there were certain cells that just did not match with what others should be, and that these cells stood out as being particularly unique. It was found that they had transposons or genes that jumped around a bit. These transposons were useful in that they can be used to, modify a genome to some extent. However, as we mentioned much earlier in this video, most mutations are not helpful, and in this case, they could lead to the death of the developing embryo, or in this case, more importantly, death of those cells so they can be removed without causing damage. By itself, that's helpful to know about, that these cells have a means of not only identifying that they have mutations or inconsistencies, and therefore destroying themselves, but just how many of the cells at that time are in this category. The cells have been given the name reject cells, and rather obviously because they are rejected and then destroyed, but also because they have retro elements. About a quarter of all cells at 5 days after fertilization were in this category. The argument can be made that life, and particularly natural selection, starts even before this, when you only have one sperm making its way into the egg, even if there's a curseable, sudden but inevitable betrayal. In this case, it's proof that natural selection starts to apply well before you might expect it to, in the very earliest days of cellular proliferation within the uterus. And next we have the final item for this week, and it's NASA's experiment to put individuals into isolation for an entire year. The idea is to take 4 individuals, and they're going to enter into what is meant to be a simulated Martian habitat. They're going to stay there for an entire year, and the idea is to get an idea about how well humans are going to survive, and to a slightly lesser extent in terms of not killing each other, logistics. The environment does more than just isolate the individuals. They're also going to be required to take part in mock Martian expeditions, and all communication to Earth and back to Mars is done on a delay. That is, any communication will take 22 minutes to reach Earth, and then it will take 22 minutes to get back once a response has been sent. There will also be simulated emergencies and unplanned challenges. These will include things like equipment failure and water shortages, neither of which should honestly be unexpected given the nature of, being on the next planet that's habitable on the solar system, rather than being on Earth where spare parts, repairs, and specialists are at least comparably readily available. The only other noteworthy part of this is that the facility, as it's been built on Earth, is 3D printed, and this is to be able to test whether or not it's possible to do what is called in situ resource utilization. Basically, can you use what's readily available on the site and just print what you need? This technology is currently being used to some extent for housing and prefabrication of other facilities. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.